It's a technique that's tried and true, one that works as well by the side of the road as it does in a shop. In this video, we'll discuss the proper technique for mounting and demounting a heavy-duty truck tire using two standard T-45A tire irons. While there are other tools to make the job easier, mounting with tire irons is inexpensive and does as good a job as machines costing thousands of dollars. Before you start, ensure your work area is clean and free of trip hazards. A mat or thin piece of carpeting is helpful to eliminate scratching the wheels. It's also a better non-slip surface than your painted shop floor. Additionally, it is essential that the person doing the mounting is wearing proper personal protective equipment. Gloves, steel-toed work boots, and safety glasses are minimum requirements. The three most important items of any mounting system are adequate use of lubrication, appropriate use of the tools, and proper bead seating. We will get into more details with each of these throughout the video. In choosing a lube, it's important to select a vegetable-based lubricant that does not contain any petroleum distillates. Petroleum distillates can swell the rubber on the tire and cause it to break down. Make sure that you only dilute the lube to the specifications of the manufacturer. Some shops will try to dilute the lube additionally to save money. This is a bad idea because the $1 or $2 you save on a bucket of lube will be hard to make up the first time you ruin the bead of a tire that costs hundreds of dollars. Now that we've discussed the prerequisites, let's begin to mount our tire. The first thing you should do is inspect the wheel. Any bent or broken wheels should be discarded. Never weld or apply heat to any wheel components. Any small burrs should be removed by gently filing. Next, inspect the wheel to ensure that it is the proper size, weight, and pressure rating. The wheel should be cleaned of any rust, prior mounting residue, or rubber buildup. A wire brush works well for removing any residue. The reason it is important to remove this buildup is that the beads will have a much better chance of properly seating on a clean rim flange. You also need to inspect the valve stem. Look for bent or cracked stems and inspect the rubber valve grommet or O-ring to make sure it's not cracked, over-torqued, or deteriorating. Some fleets prefer to replace the whole valve assembly every time a new tire is mounted because the cost of a new stem is cheap compared to a tire failure from a leaky stem. Be sure and follow all manufacturer specs on the valve installation. Now that the wheel is inspected, we must do the same for the tire. Inspect the tire to determine that the rim diameter is the same as that of the wheel. Ensure that the tire being mounted has at least 4 30-seconds remaining tread depth for steer axle use and 2 30-seconds for drive or trailer use. Check the tire for any cuts or damages to steel. Pay special attention to the bead area because any cuts here can lead to failures down the road. Look at the inside and both sidewalls of the tire for signs of run flat, a potentially dangerous condition that could lead to a zipper rupture. If the tire is used, make sure that the tire's DOT and repair limits are not past fleet specs. We are now ready to lube both the wheel and tire. Start lubricating the wheel using a generous amount of lube. Lubricate both flange areas and the drop center. Some shops prefer to use a lube swab, and some like to use an old glove. It is important not to scrimp on lube, because this prevents tire damage and makes the job of mounting less physical. Now, lubricate the tire's beads. Lube both sides from the bead toe to the bead heel. It also helps to run a quick pass of lube on the inside bead on the side that will be the last to press over the wheel flange. For mounting, we will start directly opposite the wheel valve and with the short side of the wheel facing up. Roll the tire up as close to the wheel as you can. Grab the tire at 10 and 2 and try to push the first bead on. Do not jump on the tire, kick it on with your boot, or use a hammer. Now position one tire iron in between the gap of the wheel and the bead area, which is still raised off the wheel. Don't put the iron at the center of the gap, as this can deform the bead. Instead, take a smaller bite, approximately 2 inches in. Step into the wheel center and push the iron across the tire to finish putting the first bead on. Use good ergonomic sense. Don't twist your back and try and pull on the iron. Next, step up on the tire with both feet firmly planted, shoulder width apart. Now, pry the top bead over the wheel flange using the curved end of the iron. Keep the foot opposite the bar firmly planted and don't reposition it. The other foot can be moved to hold the tire in place as you continue to work the bead on. Here again, take small bites to ease the mounting process and avoid bead damage. If after prying the second bead over the flange, there is a small part of the bead stuck above the flange, resist the temptation to knock the balance on with a hammer. This action could damage the bead toe. With proper lube and a full push on the iron, the bead should drop in place. Now that we've mounted the tire on the wheel, it's time to seat the beads. Prior to inflation or any time you work with compressed air, always wear safety glasses. OSHA guidelines require the tire to be inflated in an approved safety cage. However, the first 3 to 5 psi of air pressure may be applied to the tire outside the safety cage to properly seat the beads. If the initial inflation is done with the tire and wheel standing vertically, the weight of the wheel pushing down on the 2 beads must be overcome in order to center the wheel on the tire. A good practice to follow that will ensure the tire beads are seated properly is to lay the tire and wheel horizontally on the ground, or better yet, use a 5-gallon bucket as a stand, which will keep the bottom sidewall from touching the ground. Connect the air hose fitted with a clip-on air chuck with an inline valve or presettable regulator and a sufficient length of hose to allow the technician to stand outside of the trajectory zone to the valve stem with the valve core removed and apply just enough air to seat the beads. OSHA regulations stipulate this should be no more than 5 psi. Remove the clip-on chuck and install a valve cap. Now that the beads are seated, it is time to fully inflate the tire. Using your legs and not your back, lift the tire and roll it into the safety cage. If you use the bucket method, the tire is already partway off the ground and is easier to lift. While standing outside the trajectory zone, inflate the tire to 20 psi. Look for distortions, ripples, or bulges, and listen for any popping sounds. If any of these conditions are present, the tire should be made unusable and scrapped. Never inflate beyond 40 psi to seat the beads. If after 40 psi the beads have not seated, stop, deflate, and determine the problem. If none of these conditions are present with the valve core still removed, inflate the tire to 20 psi over the recommended operating pressure. Never exceed the maximum pressure of the wheel. During this step, if any of the above conditions appear, immediately stop inflation and get out of the immediate area. Any steel radial suspected of having been underinflated and/or overloaded should utilize the 20-20 rule. In other words, keep the tire at 20 psi over operating pressure for 20 minutes. Please refer to the RMA chart on zipper ruptures for more information. If you see any signs of potential zipper ruptures, the tire should be made unusable and scrapped. Now install a valve core, reduce the air pressure to the fleet standard, and place a metal self-sealing valve cap on the stem. Some fleets prefer dual-seal flow-through caps because they allow the air pressure to be checked without removing the cap. The final step is to make sure the tire is centered on the wheel by checking the distance between the guide rib or GG ring and the wheel flange with a small machinist rule available at most hardware stores. Compare at least 4 locations around the tire. The measurement should vary no more than 2/32 of an inch. A good rule of thumb is to check at 3, 6, 9, and 12. Mismount occurs when the tire beads do not seat fully on the tapered rim flange area of the wheel. As can be seen in this diagram, one of the tire beads has fully seated against the rim flange, but in another small area, the bead did not climb completely up the tapered area of the wheel. In this area, the bead is tucked further under the rim, making the sidewall slightly shorter. If the tire mismount is not detected immediately, the tire may develop localized shoulder wear. Eventually, the tire wear pattern will appear around the rest of the shoulder, sometimes resulting in a noticeable ride disturbance. If mismount is detected, deflate, dismount, inspect, re-lube, and remount the tire. For a detailed discussion on mismount, please refer to the run-out and match mounting video from this series. After following the previous steps, you may now place the tire into service. At some point during the tire's life, it will become necessary to dismount the tire. The first step is to completely deflate the tire by removing the valve cap and valve core. Run a wire down the valve stem to make sure that it is free of debris. Next, break the beads using a bead breaker tool or with a duckbill hammer. Never swing the duckbill hammer to strike the tire and wheel. It could result in severe tire damage and/or personal injury. The proper use of a duckbill hammer for unseating beads is as a wedge. Force the wedge end between the wheel and sidewall by striking the flat end with a rubber mallet or dead blow hammer. It is a direct OSHA violation to strike metal on metal. Turn the assembly over and repeat this process to break the bottom bead. Lubricate the bead and wheel surfaces with an approved rubber lubricant. It is okay to use a more viscous solution here, just don't delay and let it dry out. Finish with the narrow side of the wheel facing up. For mounting, we started opposite the valve stem. For dismounting, we start at the valve stem. Insert the tire irons with the knuckle facing toward the rim flange approximately 3 inches to either side of the valve stem. Grab the tops of both irons, step into the wheel well, and push the irons down to the opposite side of the wheel. Now remove one tire iron, turn it around, and insert the curved end between the bead and rim flange. It helps to give the base of the iron a slight kick sideways to make sure it is securely seated. Push down on the iron to pry the bead over the flange. Now, grab the unused iron as it is dislodged and repeat this process until the entire first bead is over the rim flange. In order to remove the second bead, the assembly must be lifted into a vertical position. Here's a trick. Insert the flat end of one iron into a handhole, put one hand on the tire, and pick the bar up using it as a lever to make the job of lifting the entire assembly less strenuous. Remember to lift with your legs. Insert the flat end of the iron between the bead and back rim flange. Make sure the notch on the flat portion is present and facing up. The rest of the process is as simple as flip, click, and drop. In other words, flip the iron so that the notch now faces down. Pull back on the iron until you hear a click when the notch catches the wheel flange. Finally, allow the assembly to drop while pulling up on the tire iron. If gravity didn't do the trick, you may need to use a rocking or bouncing action to dislodge the wheel from the tire. Mounting the tire is where it all starts, and by using the proper technique, you will be safer, have less driver complaints, and achieve better tire performance.
Michelin, a better way forward.